In this video, we'll take a look at Note Mode, which allows you to play instruments. This mode is comprised of two sub-modes, Scale and Drum Rack. These will be automatically selected depending on the contents of the track. If the track doesn't contain a drum rack, you'll be in the Scale sub-mode. And if the track does contain a drum rack, then you'll be in the Drum Rack sub-mode. In the Scale sub-mode, the matrix will be assigned to a particular scale. The default scale is C major. By default, an isomorphic layout is used, where each of the rows ascends by force. This makes it very easy to play scales, as well as chords. The second set of navigation buttons will move the octave up and down. When Shift is pressed, these will move up and down by a semitone. When the Select button is pressed, you'll switch to the Scale Select page. The upper three rows of buttons select the scale type to use. So for example, I can select a blues scale or a minor scale. By default, only the notes within the scale will be accessible. This is called In Key. This button here switches between In Key and Chromatic. With Chromatic, every note will be accessible. Buttons that are assigned to notes that aren't within the scale will be dark. As I mentioned before, by default, an isomorphic layout is used. This button here allows you to switch to a sequent layout, where the notes are laid out sequentially. The bottom two rows select the root note. Right now that's C. I can, for example, change that to F. You can also capture the notes from a clip and turn those into a playable scale. To give you an example of this, I've got a clip here with some chords in it. With this button here, I can capture the notes from that clip. And now the matrix will be assigned to multiple octaves of those notes. To give you an example of how this is useful, I can switch to another track and experiment with a mid-bass part in a lower octave. When Delete is pressed, the matrix can be used for deleting notes. By default, the buttons in the matrix will just play a single note. When this button is on, they'll play repeated notes. The rest of the buttons here will select the note repeat rate. When Shift is held down, these buttons will select the amount of swing to apply to the repeated notes. The first two navigation buttons navigate between scenes. As we saw before, the second two are used for moving between octaves. And when the Select button is held down, these can be used for navigating between tracks. In the Drum Rack sub-mode, the lower left quadrant plays the visible pads in the drum rack. The second set of navigation buttons will move the drum rack selector up or down by 4 rows. When Shift is pressed, they'll move the drum rack selector up or down by 1 row. When Select is pressed, these buttons will select drum rack pads. When Mute is pressed, these buttons will mute drum rack pads. Holding down Mute and pressing Shift will unmute all drum rack pads. When Select and Mute are pressed, these buttons will solo drum rack pads. Pressing Select, Mute, and then Shift will unsolo all drum rack pads. The side buttons have 2 sets of functions. We'll look at the first set in just a minute. The second set, though, is Note Repeat, and this works just like we saw in the Scale sub-mode. The upper 4 rows are used for step sequencing the selected drum rack pad. When Mute is pressed, these buttons can be used for muting steps. When Shift is pressed, the bottom 4 side buttons select the velocity to use for inputting steps. By default, these buttons select static velocities. Pressing them a second time will activate random velocities. By default, the side buttons select the resolution to use for step sequencing. Right now that's set to 16th notes. I'll change that to 32nd notes. Each button here represents one sequencer page. Pressing one of these buttons will select a single sequencer page. And this supports multiple button presses to allow multiple pages to be selected. When Shift is pressed, these buttons will just select the page to edit without affecting the loop. So here I'll add some 32nd notes to the second page. When Shift is pressed, this button here can be used for doubling the contents of the clip. So now there's 4 pages. When Delete is pressed, The left lower quadrant can be used for deleting notes, and the right lower quadrant can be used for deleting entire pages.